Okay, so we finished up phylum Cnidaria. That's where we left off. We were talking about the Cnidarians. And I want to move on to the next section. So if we look at our overall family tree, we've been working our way up. The Cnidarians and the Stenophora were over here. These organisms are still diploblasts. As we move into Locotrophozoa, which is shown here in blue, we are actually moving into those organisms that have triploblastic development, right? So when they go through that embryological development, our little blastula is going to push in and during gastralization, and then the mesenteries are going to form. We're going to have the mesoderm layer popping out. So the term Lophotrochozoa, that overarching theme, is referring to the type of larva that these organisms have. And so this little larva here is a lophophore larva, and this larva over here is a trochophore larva. We're not going to go into the details about larval anatomy and talk about what that means, but the name comes from the existence of one of these forms of larva in the early development of these organisms. So that's their evolutionary tie. They all have triploblastic formation, and they have these common larval forms. They apply to all of the Lophotrochozoans. Yep. So they are all bilaterally symmetrical. They all have triploblastic development. They are all protostomes, mouth first. They all have a tissue organ grade of complexity. So that means they have true tissues, and they also have organs, and most often organ systems. And then they have this lophophore or trochophore larval form. Okay. Just like everything else, there may be some exceptions as we go through, but this is sort of their evolutionary history is to have all of these characteristics. This group has these things in common. So the first organism that we want to talk about in the Locotrophozoa are the Platyhelminthes. This worm, helminth, refers to worm. So if you buy anti-helminthic for your animals, you're buying an anti-wormer, right? And platy means flat. So these are the flatworms. You guys already looked at platyhelminthes last week in lab. If you looked at the planarians and you saw their sort of flattened body, they're some of my favorite invertebrates. I think they're adorable. So they have the characteristics of the whole group, right? Triploblastic with bilateral symmetry, tissue organ grade of complexity. They were also our characteristic representative for an acoelomate body cavity when we talked about body cavity formation. The entirety of the space that could be their body cavity is filled in with mesoderm. So in this image, the ectoderm is here in blue, the endoderm, the lining of the gastrovascular tract is in, or gastrovascular cavity is in yellow, and then the orangish red here is all mesoderm. Okay. They also have cephalization. They have nerve ganglion at the anterior region. They have sensory organs. They have eye cups at the anterior region. They have a gastrovascular cavity with only one opening. So this is more analogous to our cnidarians. They don't have a complete digestive tract yet. They still have a gastrovascular cavity with one opening for in and out. They have contractile tissues and simple nerves. They exist in a lot of different environments that are wet or damp. So they're marine, they can be freshwater. The ones that we were looking at are freshwater, and they're common in this area. If you were to go out in a wetland or in a stream and turn over rocks, you would probably find planaria in that water. They can also live in damp terrestrial areas, so places where there's moist soil, moist moss, something to keep their bodies damp. They can reproduce asexually or sexually, and many of the species are capable of self-fertilization. And so they actually reproduce sexually with themselves. So I want to show you first a couple of images of their basic body layout using the planarian as the example. So if you watched the planarian feed and you answered the question in lab last week, you probably noticed that their mouth is not where you expect it to be. Okay, you expect the mouth to be at the anterior region. These guys, the mouth is almost in the center of the body. If anything, it's a little bit posterior of center. And the mouth is on a pharynx that is actually able to come out of the body kind of like an elephant trunk. They have this muscular, I think of it like a vacuum cleaner hose, because they're detritivores and scavengers, and you can watch them kind of like, literally like suck things up off of the surface of something that they're feeding on. They'll pull that food in through the mouth, and then that food goes through all of the gastrovascular cavity. So everything shown here in this peachy color is all gastrovascular cavity, and it has all sorts of these finger-like protrusions. What are those for? More surface area, right? And they're diffuse throughout the entire body because the way this organism moves nutrients, it doesn't have a circulatory system. Nutrients diffuse directly out of the gastrovascular cavity and into the rest of the tissues. So nutrients move out into the body and diffuse from cell to cell to get through the body. There's no circulatory system sort of running the plumbing of their body. You can also see the nervous system is in yellow here, and so they have a pair of nerve cords that culminate in the anterior end in a cluster of nervous tissue known as a ganglia. And so there's a big region of nervous tissue around the eye cups, and then they have these nerves that go along each side of the body. Okay. The eye cups are photoreceptors, and so they're able to tell light from dark, and they prefer dark, so they'll move away from the light and towards the dark. They don't see an image as much as they detect light and degree of light. Okay. And then this image shows you both the reproductive system we just looked at and the nervous system, and then also along here in green, the excretory system. And so they have a series of canals in which waste and excess water are filtered out and moved into the excretory canal. And then they have these, oh, I meant to change this, sorry. They have these interesting cells that are sort of like very primitive kidneys. They have these excretory cells that are able to filter out waste and conserve water when necessary. And then they open up into a pore that dumps that waste out to the outside of the body. And so they have this sort of filtration system for waste. Undigested material is going to go back out through the mouth opening, but waste like excess nitrogens and amino groups and toxins and things they're processing, if they go into a fluid waste, they move out through these excretory pores. I think I was telling you guys when we talked about reproduction that planaria can reproduce asexually by a process known as fission. They can do this themselves intentionally by constricting their tissues and causing the tissue to separate, or they can do it anytime that they're damaged. So if you nick a planaria between the eyes, it's going to divide into two heads and then split along this line into two separate bodies. If you take the planaria and chop it into little segments, take the head off, take the bottom off, take the middle out, all of those pieces can regrow an entire individual. And these guys have the ability to learn complex behaviors. They can be taught to run mazes. And if you teach planaria to run a maze and then you chop it up, all of the offspring planaria remember how to do the maze. And so they actually have cellular learning and memory for activities that they've been taught to do. So they're simple. They don't look like much. They're really tiny, but they're complex organisms. We often give invertebrates the short shrift, but these guys have, the ability to learn and remember a maze, and they can retain that capacity after regeneration. We can't do that. Cut us into pieces, we're done. That's for sure. I did read that if you blend them and they regenerate, they don't remember. But I don't know who did the experiment that put the planaria in the blender. I would not be okay with that. Yeah, so asexual reproduction is making a clone of yourself. Self-fertilization is sexually reproducing with yourself. And so using eggs and sperm that you created in your body and bringing them together. Well, but you might be reorganizing how those come together. So you have the same genes, but depending on how you distributed those genes into your eggs and sperm, you may not produce an identical offspring to your starting point. Yeah, so you're able to shuffle up your genes and redistribute them. And so if you are a heterozygous individual for a particular gene and you sexually reproduce with yourself, you could produce a homozygous individual for that gene in either way, depending on how those genes were distributed into egg and sperm, right? Does that make sense? Okay. So many of the platyhelminthes, in fact, I think almost all of them are hermaphroditic. And so if you look at this individual, here's our planaria again, and now we have their reproductive tissue shown. And so in pink, imagine that, we have the ovaries and the oviduct, and here are all the oviducts running down each side. And then we have the testes, or these little blue bulbs, and we have the canals connecting all of the testes. We have a penis here and a genital pore here. Okay. Many of these individuals have what's known as hypodermic insemination, which means that the penis is less of a copulatory structure and more like a hypodermic syringe or a needle, and it stabs through the tissue, creating a wound, and then distributes the semen through that wound. And so that wound doesn't necessarily have to happen down here. It can happen up here. They move everything through diffusion, and so they can actually just distribute the sperm throughout the body to the ovaries. Okay. Um, Traumatic self-insemination is a term that's often used. They prefer to mate with another individual. There's usually some sort of wrestling match or sword play with the penises to determine who gets to deliver the sperm in that interaction. But if they don't have a potential mate, they just curl up and inseminate themselves. And so sometimes they might, because of how their bodies are shaped, stab themselves in the head or in the face, but that works. And so they're able to do what's called traumatic self-insemination. Not every species, but it's common in planaria and flatworms in general. These guys are all free-living flatworms. They're in the main group, planarians. Over here are our little brown guys that we've been looking at. And then these are two really fancy colored marine organisms. Marine flatworms are common in reef areas, some tidal areas, shallow marine waters. But we also have a lot of flatworms that are parasitic. So if you've ever heard of a tapeworm, that is a parasitic flatworm. And a fluke, like a liver fluke or a blood fluke, if you've heard those two terms, those are also parasitic flatworms. And so these are all various flukes of different sizes. And then over here we have the tapeworm. And the tapeworm has hooks and suckers on the anterior end, or on the posterior end, and then a solex on the anterior end. And all of those little individual shapes of the tapeworm are actually reproductive structures. And each one of those shapes has both ovaries and testes in it. And so if a tapeworm is in a body with another tapeworm, those two tapeworms can reproduce sexually. If the tapeworm is in a body by itself, it can fold itself in half and line up. Each one of these little structures is called a protoglottid, protoglottid to protoglottid, and sexually reproduce with itself square after square after square. These squares can also be shed and they break off, and if they go out in the feces of the organism that the tapeworm is inhabiting, each one of them can grow into a new individual. So they have remarkable sexual and asexual reproductive abilities, and that's part of the reason they're such effective organisms. Okay, any questions about flatworms? Spent a lot of time on flatworms. I think they're cool. All right, so now we're gonna, as we move into our next groups, we're gonna make some leaps evolutionarily. So I just want to pause and talk about some of those evolutionary steps. So the first thing I want to talk about is body cavities. And so the next groups of organisms we're going to see are either going to be pseudocoelomate or fully coelomate. Okay. So when we move from being acoelomate to pseudocoelomate, we get some advantages, right? There is a system for nutrient distribution. There is space and room for waste storage and removal more effectively. We've got this fluid-filled body cavity that we can move things through and distribute things through. There's also space to store gametes while they mature, and so we can put developing gametes out into that body cavity space and store them. This is on the second one. Yep. I think this is on the second one. I posted the two separate files because of the size of the pictures. Yeah. I think it says 28 part 2, or 28.2, 28.1, and 28.2. Yeah. This space also functions as a hydrostatic skeleton. We were talking about that. Muscles can contract against the fluid, and so it's going to give them some advantages for mobility. And then there's some space for loosely organized organ systems. We do have mesoderm. It's not like there isn't any tissue in there. And that mesoderm can be used to anchor organs and organ systems and kind of hold them in place together. So you start to organize things in that pseudocoelom space. Okay. Does that make sense? Everybody has that? When you go on to a coelom, you just take that to the next level. So all of the things that are advantages for pseudocoelomates are also advantages for coelomates. They still have those benefits, but they have some additional benefits, which is that now full mesenteries form. And mesenteries are formed by the span of the mesoderm between the outer layer and the inner layer. And so now we have better anchoring. We actually have tissue that can be used to really organize and anchor organ systems. And so as we move to coelomate organisms, we have even more complex organ systems and more permanently anchored structures. You also now have the ability for a blood vessel network. So you can move nutrients and gases and materials through a blood vessel network to those highly organized organ systems. Okay. There's connectivity because of that complete mesentery to move materials to all of the organs. And then the space and connectivity is still there, but we have more connectivity, and so we have these more highly organized organ systems. And then the next thing, one of the big jumps with having a coelom is that you can have a muscular alimentary canal or a muscular gastrovascular system or digestive tract. Because we have that mesoderm completely surrounding the endoderm, now the mesoderm can function as muscles that squeeze the endoderm, squeeze the digestive tract. So now we can manipulate food as it moves through the digestive system and regulate its passage. Okay. Can expand and contract the size of openings of organs because we can press against them with mesenteries and muscles. Does that make sense? The other thing that we're going to see is we're going to start having circulatory systems. So up until now, we've had gastrovascular cavities, and those gastrovascular cavities have done both nutrient distribution and gas distribution. So oxygen comes in, carbon dioxide moves out, right? Now we're going to start to see circulatory systems. And open circulatory systems are going to include networks through which materials circulate that are also connected to open spaces. So if you look in the body of our grasshopper here, this space here that is filled with like unregulated green fluid down here at the bottom is known as the hemocoel. And that word hemo refers to blood and coel refers to cavity or space, right? So this is the blood cavity. And this is where the circulatory fluids, the hemolymph, are going to just pool freely. So rather than having capillaries and narrow closed circulatory systems that deliver materials to the organs are actually just bathed in this fluid. And so blood coming from the heart, which is here, our dorsal vessel heart portion, is going to pump into the hemocoel. And here we have in blue our digestive tract. That organ is just bathed in the hemolymph. And so the fluid is going to pass over it. Things move in and out through diffusion. Okay. And then materials can be returned back to the pumping section of the circulatory system. We have a similar situation down here in our bivalve. You can see all of the organs, the stomach, the heart. Down here we have the intestine. And then in blue here, around the intestine, we have that hemocoel, that open space with fluid in it. Okay. You can compare that to what you're maybe more familiar with in your own bodies, a closed circulatory system, right? In a closed circulatory system, the blood never free pools around the organs or in open spaces. Instead, the blood is always contained within vessels of the circulatory system. And those vessels vary in size. Arteries go down to capillaries. Um, Oxygenated blood travels through the arteries, through the capillaries, out to organs and muscles and glands. And then deoxygenated blood returns through capillaries into veins and back for oxygenation in the pumping organ, right? So we see this in earthworms. We see a version of it in fish, and we'll come back and look at this some more when we move on to vertebrates as well. But just thinking about the difference there. So some of the organisms we're going to see in this group have a closed circulatory system and some have an open circulatory system. And so we're going to just use those terms to describe the way this organism moves nutrients and gases through its body. So we're going to move on to talking about our next group of invertebrates, which are the mollusks. And the phylum name is Mollusca, and the common name is mollusk. It's really creative, right? So if you use a CA, mollusca, you're saying the phylum name. Use a K for the common name, mollusk. It doesn't make any sense to me. We're going to have many groups of these, and so we'll think of them by their more common group names: the snails, the squid, octopuses, oysters or mussels or clams, right? We'll think about them in those groupings. These guys are all soft-bodied animals, so their bodies are soft and a little bit squishy, but they have a mantle and something that often creates a protective layer or some sort of shell. And so many of them are actually able to build their own shell. Others have like an internal shell or a pen that provides some structure, but is not actually an external shell. These guys all have well-developed organ systems. So we're going to start to see organs we recognize in these organisms. Bilateral symmetry, coelomate body plan. Some have cephalization, some don't, depending on the organism. The head is maybe very prominent or might not exist at all. They have a complete digestive tract with 2 openings. So now food is going to pass completely through the tract and undigested material is going to go out the anus, as opposed to having a single opening to a gastrovascular cavity. Okay. And then the 3 things that are really that are the common hallmark of all mollusks are the presence of a muscular foot, so a large muscular mass that's going to be used for locomotion. The visceral mass, which is the core body that contains the organs and the organ systems. And then the mantle, which may or may not secrete a shell. And the mantle is essentially the dorsal epidermis. So the epidermis on the dorsal side. It's reinforced and in many organisms actually creates a hardened calcium carbonate shell for protection. The Yeah, it's where the pen is inside the squid or where the bone is inside the cuttlefish. Um, but it's the dorsal side, the spine side. It's not necessarily like the head. Okay, so here's one example of snail morphology, one mollusk. Um, Snail morphology is really tricky and weird because as the snail develops, the entire body and the visceral mass has to undergo torsion and twist in order to fit inside the shell as the shell is formed. And so this is why I was saying that some snails have the problem of their anus being directly over their gill. They also can find their anus directly over their head. And that's because the whole body has to twist in order to reshape, in order to accommodate being scrunched inside of the shell. And so you see some unexpected organ placement in many snails. In this body, we see the muscular foot down here in gray. We have a nerve ring and nerve cords going down through that foot. The mantle is shown in this pink arch right here, the dorsal epidermis. And then the mantle secretes in this organism the shell, which is in beige above the mantle. You see the organ systems, the mouth opening is here, going through the digestive system and out to the anus. The circulatory system is in red, the heart is here, the gill is here. The coelom is this smaller space, they have a reduced coelom. The reproductive organs are actually up here. And then many of our gastropods have this radula, and the radula is a scraping tongue-like conveyor belt structure that they use to bring food in. So if a snail is snacking on some vegetation or scraping some algae off of a rock, it's using these backward pointing teeth of the radula to do that scraping, and then food gets caught in the teeth and moves into the mouth and enters the digestive tract. And so they have this little scraping organ that they use. So the first class we want to mention are the gastropods. These are the snails and slugs. This is the largest class of mollusks. They are really diverse. There are a lot of different species, and they live in a lot of different types of environments. And so we find them both in freshwater and marine water, and we also find them living in terrestrial environments. And some of them, remarkably, even live in arid environments. And so we actually can find snails in fairly dry environments as long as they have the ability to hunker down and get through the driest season inside their shell. They can survive. You can think of them as being one-footed crawlers. They have their large muscular foot that they use for locomotion. We have a bunch of aquatic snails today. We only had a couple of last week. I got some more. Unfortunately, did anybody find slugs in their yard? I had my friend in Springfield. Her son was out in the backyard all morning, turning over everything, chipping through ice, looking for slugs. No slugs. So no luck there. But you can watch the snails move in those dishes, and you can actually watch the foot undulate. You can see the muscularization of it and how it helps them to move along. So often they'll be attached to the glass. And so you can take the dish or the bowl that they're in and attach to and put a lid on it and flip it if necessary so that you can see their foot with your dissecting scope and watch them move. The slugs are just, well, this guy here is a whelk. These guys are snails. They have shells. The slug and sea slugs and other marine organisms that don't have shells still have that muscular foot and move in a very similar way. They just don't have a protective shell. These guys many of them are hermaphrodites. Some of them have separate sexes. They all carry out sexual reproduction. And there's often traumatic insemination in snails especially, and individuals who play both male and female roles simultaneously or interchangeably back and forth. The next group that we want to mention are the bivalves. The word bivalve means two shells, and these are the tasty mollusks, probably the ones that are eaten the most by humans and also by many other organisms. They are mussels, clams, scallops, and oysters. So these guys are kind of an exception in the mollusks in that they don't have any head or cephalization. They actually have a pretty different body plan than the rest of the mollusks in terms of not having a head and having fewer sensory organs than some of the other mollusks. They're also filter feeders, so they don't have a radula, and they're going to be bringing in debris and food particles that they sieve out of the water column by creating a water current and moving that current across their bodies and collecting materials from that water. Okay. The shell is in two halves and it is fused together at a hinge. And they do what movement and anchoring that they do via a muscular foot. And so you might see some mussels and think, oh, those guys are pretty sedentary. They never move. Every now and then I order mussels for this class, but I feel bad because I don't have a way to keep them alive. And so I don't order them very often. But you'll just leave the mussel in the aquarium and you come back a few hours later and it's like completely buried itself in the substrate at the bottom of the aquarium. And they do that using their muscular foot. And so they can actually extend their foot out of their shell and use it to crawl along the surface and to dig in the sand and kind of bury themselves down. If any of you have ever gone looking for clams at low tide, you kind of look for the water squirt coming up out of the mud, right? They dig themselves down in the mud to stay moist. So they do all of that moving with their muscular foot. Some of them, particularly some of the scallops and oysters, also move by clamping their shell. And so this is like such a cartoon thing. You might see it in an animated version, but they will try to get away from something that is a potential predator or something that scares them by opening their shell really wide and then closing it fast, and that pushes them backwards in the water column. And so they'll, in order to like push themselves backwards through the water. These guys are all filter feeders, and so here's sort of a typical mussel. You look at the shell from the outside, that's what you see. They can pull all of their soft tissue into that shell, and so you might not be able to see any of their soft tissue. But if they're out feeding, you might be able to see their muscular foot sticking out from one end, the anterior end, and you might be able to see the excurrent and incurrent siphons. And so incurrent siphon brings water in, it travels through the animal's body and then gets propelled back out through the excurrent siphon. It brings in food and oxygen and takes away waste and carbon dioxide, right, as you move through that current system. And so if we look, we've got our in-current flow here, and some sand and debris and particles that are in the water are going to come in to the in-current siphon along with potential food items and going to flow over the gills. Heavy things drop away, so sand and debris are going to drop away from the gills and leave the organism's body. But potential food items are going to stick to the edge of the gills, and they actually slide down to the bottom of the gills and travel in a mucus tract. And so they actually create a mucus-like substance to catch food, and then that mucus tract moves towards the mouth, which is up here. Water is also passing over these gills, and so they're extracting oxygen from those gills. Food moves into the mouth and goes through the digestive system, and the water travels back out through the excurrent flow, taking away carbon dioxide, waste, and water, leaving the body. Okay. Then we have the cephalopods. The word cephalopod means head foot. These guys have a closed circulatory system. So the other mollusks have an open circulatory system in some areas, and now we have a closed circulatory system in the cephalopods. They have beak-like jaws. All of them are agile predators. This is, if you want to go down a really fun YouTube rabbit hole, Google octopuses feeding on anything. They will come up out of the water and catch shorebirds and other land animals. They use tools. They'll carry coconut shells with them to use as shelters. It's a very fun rabbit hole to go down. They move by expelling water through a siphon, and so they have a siphon that they're able to pressurize and blast water out of the siphon and use that to move. And they have large brains and complex senses. Octopuses have been taught to solve all sorts of problems and use reasoning. They're escape artists. They can unscrew a jar from the inside and get out. And they can fit through pretty much anything that is the diameter of their eyeball or bigger. So they're really hard to keep in aquariums because they can escape through the tubing systems of the aquarium and get into other aquariums and eat rare fish and cause other general havoc. Everybody who's ever worked in a marine aquarium has stories about the octopus that caused problems because they're clever and agile and have the ability to very much manipulate the shape of their body. All of them possess tentacles. So down here we have a cuttlefish. If you've ever given a pet bird a cuttlebone, it's the internal structure of the cuttlefish. Here's a squid. You can see the beak-like jaw at the mouth of the squid. Nautiluses are very evolutionarily primitive, been around forever. You find their representation throughout the fossil record, but they're still alive now. And then we have octopus. And I'm going to, especially because you guys are stressed out today, I'm going to show you an octopus video.